I put the shotgun in the Adidas bag and I padded out with 4 pairs of tennis socks. Not my style at all, but that was what I was aiming for. If they think you're crude, go technical. And they think you're technical, go crude. And I'm a very technical boy. So, I decided to get as crude as possible. And these days, though, you have to be pretty technical before you can go even aspiring to crudeness. I've had to turn both those 12-gauge shells from brass stock on the lathe and then load them myself. I'd have to dig up an old microfiche with instructions for hand-loading cartridges. I'd have to build a lever-action press to seat the primers. All very tricky, but I knew they'd work. The meet was set for the Drome at 2300, but I rode the tube 3 stops past the closest platform and walked back. Immaculate procedure. I checked myself out in the chrome siding of a coffee kiosk. Your basic sharp-faced caucasoid with a rough or stiff dark hair. The girls at Under the Knife were big on Sony Mao, and it was getting harder to keep them from adding the chic suggestion of epithetic folds. It probably wouldn't fool Ralphie Face, but it might get me next to his table. The Drome is a single narrow space with a bar down one side and tables along the other, thick with pimps and handlers, an arcane array of dealers. The magnetic dog sisters were on the door that night, and I didn't relish trying to get out past them if things didn't work out. They were 2 meters tall, thin as greyhounds. One was black and the other white, but aside from that, they were nearly identical as cosmetic surgery can make them. They'd been lovers for years, and were bad news in a tussle. I was never quite sure which one had originally been male, but Ralphie was sitting at his usual table, and that I did know. Owing me a lot of money, you understand. I had hundreds of megabytes stashed in my head, on an idiot savant basis of information. I had no conscious access to it at all. And Ralphie, you see, had left it there. He hadn't, however, come back for it. Only Ralphie could retrieve the data, with a code phrase of his own invention. I'm not cheap to begin with, but my overtime on storage is astronomical, and Ralphie had been very scarce. Then, I'd heard that Ralphie Face wanted to put out a contract on me. So, I'd arranged to meet him in the Drome. But I'd arranged it as Edward Bax, you see, clandestine importer, late of Rio and Peking. And the Drome stank of biz, a metallic tang of nervous tension. Muscle boys scattered through the crowd were flexing stock parts at one another and trying on this, cold grins, some of them so lost under superstructures of muscle graft that their outlines weren't really human. Pardon me, friends, just Eddie Banks here. Fast Eddie Banks, the importer, with his professionally nondescript gym bag. And please ignore this. Just wide enough to admit with my right hand. The thing is, Ralphie wasn't alone. 8 kilos of blonde California beef perched alertly in the chair next to him, martial arts written all over him. Fast Eddie Bax was in the chair opposite them before the beef's hands were off the table. "You a black belt?" I asked him, and he nodded. Blue eyes running an automatic scanning pattern between his eyes and my hands. "Yeah, me too. Got mine here in my bag." And I shoved my hand through the slit and thumbed the safety off. Click. Double 12 gauge with the trigger wired together. "Hey, that's a gun," Ralphie said, putting a plump, restraining hand on his boy's taut blue nylon chest. "Johnny has an antique firearm in his bag." So much for Edward Bax. I guess he'd always been Ralphie something or other, but he owed his acquired surname to a singular vanity. built something like an overripe pear. He'd worn the one famous face of Christian White for nearly 20 years. Christian White of the Attian reggae band Sony Mao to his generation, and final champion of reggae rock. See, I'm a whiz at trivia. Christian White, classic pop face with a singer's high-definition muscles, chiseled cheekbones, angelic in one light, handsomely depraved in another. But Ralphie's eyes lived behind that face, and they were small and cold, black. Hey, please, let's work this out like businessmen. His voice was marked with a horrible, prehensile sincerity, and the corners of his beautiful Christian White mouth were always wet. Yeah, you gotta understand, Lewis here is a meatball. Lewis took his impassively looking something built from a kit. You aren't a meatball, are you, Lewis?
I sure am, Ralphie. A nice meatball. Chock full of implants where you can store your dirty laundry. Ralphie, it looks like we might have some explaining to do.
Yeah, it's this last batch of product, Johnny. In my role as broker, fence, I corrected. As broker, I'm usually very careful as to sources. You only buy from those who steal the best. Got it. He sighed again. Yeah, try. Not to buy from fools. This time I'm afraid I've done that. Third sigh was the cue for Lewis. To trigger the neutral disruptor, they taped under my side of the table, and I put everything I had into curling the index finger of my right hand. But I no longer seemed to be connected to it. I could feel the metal of the gun and the foam-padded tape. I wrapped around my stubby grip, but my hands were cool wax, distant, inert. I was hoping Lewis was a true meatball, thick enough to go for the gym bag and snag my rigid trigger finger, but he wasn't. We've been very worried about you, Johnny. Very worried. You see, that's Yakuza property you have in there. Fool took it from them, Johnny. A dead fool. Lewis giggled. It all made sense to me then. An ugly kind of sense, like bags of wet sand settling around my head. Killing wasn't Ralphie's style, and Lewis wasn't even Ralphie's style. But he got himself stuck between the sons of the neon chrysanthemum and something that belonged to them. Or, more likely, something of theirs that belonged to someone else. Ralphie, of course, could use the code phrase to throw me into an idiot savant, and I'd spit the hot program without remembering a single quarter tone. For a fence like Ralphie, that would ordinarily have been enough. Not for the Yakuza. The Yakuza would know about squids, for one thing, and they wouldn't want to worry about one lifting those dim and permanent traces in their program out of my head. I didn't know very much about squids, but I'd heard stories, and I made it a point never to repeat them to my clients. No, the Yakuza wouldn't like that. It looked too much like evidence. They hadn't got where they were leaving by leaving evidence, or leaving evidence alive, that is. Now Lewis was grinning. I think he was visualizing a point just behind my forehead and imagining how he could get there the hard way. Hey, said a low voice, feminine, from somewhere behind my right shoulder. You cowboys sure aren't having too lively a time, are you? Hey, pack it! Lighten up. You want to buy some good bass? She pulled up a chair and quickly sat before either of them could stop her. She was barely inside my fixed field of vision, a thin girl with mirrored glasses, her dark hair cut in a rough shag. She wore black leather, open over a t-shirt slashed diagonally with stripes of red and black. I've got 8,000 grams of weight. Lewis snorted his exasperation and tried to slap her out of the chair, and somehow he didn't quite connect, and her hand came up. It seemed to brush his wrist off as it passed, and bright blood sprayed the table. He was clutching his wrist, white knuckle tight, blood trickling from between his fingers. But the odd thing was, her hand had been empty. He was going to need a tendon stapler to get back, and he stood carefully without bothering to push his chair back. The chair toppled backwards, and he stepped out of my line of sight without a word. Well, he better get a medic to look at that. That's a nasty cut. Oh, you have no idea the depths, okay, that you just got yourself into. Oh, no kidding, mister? I get real excited by mysteries like why your friend here is so quiet, frozen-like, or what this thing here is for. She held up the little control unit that she'd somehow taken from Lewis. Ralphie looked ill. You maybe want a $250,000 to give me that and take a walk? And a fat hand came up to stroke his pale, lean face nervously. What I want, she said, is work. A job. Your boy hurt his wrist, but a quarter will do for the retainer. And Ralphie left his breath out explosively and began to laugh, exposing teeth that hadn't been kept up to the Christian White standard. Then she turned the disruptor off. What about $2 million? I said. Well, you sound like my kind of man. What's in the bag? It's a shotgun. Crude. That might have been a compliment. Ralphie said nothing at all. Name's Millions. Molly Millions. You want to get out of here, boss? People are starting to stare. She stood up. She was wearing leather jeans, the color of dried blood, and I saw for the first time that the mirrored lenses were surgical inlays, the silver rising smoothly from her high cheekbones, sealing her eyes in their sockets, and I saw my new face twinned in there. I'm Johnny. We're talking to Mr. Face, and we're gonna bring him with us. And he was. He was outside waiting, looking like your standard tourist tech, in plastic Zoris and a silly Hawaiian shirt printed with blow-ups of his firm's most popular microprocessor. A mild little guy, the kind most likely to wind up drunk on sake in a bar that puts out miniature rice crackers with seaweed garnish. He looked like the kind who sing the corporate anthem and cry, shake hands endlessly with the bartender, and the pimps and the dealers would leave him alone, pegging him as innately a conservative. In other words, not up for much, careful with his credit. The way I figured it later, they must have been amputated parts of his left thumb, somewhere behind the first joint, replacing it with a prosthetic tip, and cored the stump, and fitting it with a spool and a socket molded from one of the Ono Sendai diamond analogs. Then they'd carefully wound the spool with 3 meters of monomolecular filaments. Molly got into some kind of exchange with the magnetic dog sisters I mentioned earlier, giving me a chance to usher Ralphie to the door with the gym bag pressed lightly against the base of his spine. Seemed like she knew them. I heard one of them laugh, and I glanced up. Out of some passing reflex, maybe because I never got used to it, the soaring arcs of light and the shadow of the geodesics above them. Maybe they saved me. And Ralphie, he just kept walking. I don't think he was trying to escape. I think he'd already given up. Probably he already had an idea of what we were up against. And I looked back down time to see him. I saw him explode, Playback on full recall shows Ralphie stepping forward as the little tech sidles out of nowhere, smiling. Just a suggestion of a bow, and his left thumb falls right off. It's a conjuring trick. The thumb hangs suspended. Mirrors, wires, and Ralphie, you see, stops, his back to us, dark crescent of sweat under the armpits of his pale summer suit. And he knows. He must have known. And then the joke shop thumb tip, heavy as lead, arcs out in a lightning yo-yo trick. And the invisible thread, connecting it to the killer's hand, passes laterally through Ralphie's skull, just above his eyebrows, whips, descends, slicing the pear-shaped torso diagonally from shoulder to ribcage, cut so fine that no blood even flows, until synapses misfire and the first tremors surrender the body to gravity. Ralphie tumbled apart in a pink cloud, fluids. The three mismatched sections rolling forward on the tiled pavement in total silence. I brought the gym bag up. My hand was convulsing, and the recoil nearly broke my wrist. It must have been raining. Ribbons of water cascaded from a ruptured geodesic and spattered on the tile behind us. We crouched in the narrow gap between a surgical boutique and an antique shop. She'd just about edged one mirrored eye on the corner to report a single Volks module in front of the drone, red lights all flashing. And they were sweeping Ralphie up, asking questions. I was covered in scorched white fluff, the tennis socks. The gym bag was a ragged plastic cuff around my wrist. I don't see how I missed him. 'Cause he's a faxed. That's why he's so fast. His nervous system, it's jacked up. He's a factory-made man, custom. She grinned and gave a little squeal of delight. I'm gonna get that boy. Tonight. He's the best. Number one, top dollar, state of the art. What you're going to get for this boy's $2 million is me. Out of here. Your boyfriend back there was mostly grown in a vat in Chiba City. He's a Yakuza assassin. Chiba. Yeah. See, Molly's Chiba too. Thing about me is I've never spent much time in Night Town. Nobody there had anything to pay me to remember, and most of them had a lot they paid regularly to forget. Generations of sharpshooters that clipped away at the neon until the maintenance crews just gave up. Even at noon, the arcs were suit black against faint pearl. Where do you go when the world's wealthiest criminal is feeling for you with calm, distant fingers? Where do you hide from the Yakuza so powerful that it owns comsats and at least 3 shuttles? The Yakuza is a true multinational like ITT and the Ono Sendai. 50 years before I was born, the Yakuza had already absorbed the triads, the mafia, the Union Corps. Molly had an answer. You hide. You hide in the pit, in the lowest circle, where any outside influence generates swift, concentric ripples of raw menace. You hide in Night Town, and better yet, you hide above Night Town, because the pit's inverted, and the bottom of a bowl touches the sky that Night Town never sees, sweating under its filament of acrylic resin. Up where the low-techs crouch in the dark like gargoyles, black market cigarettes dangle from their lips. And she had another answer, too. So, you're locked up good and tight, aren't you, Johnny-san? No way to get that program without the password, huh? Yeah, she led me into the shadows. Yeah, you see, the stored data are fed in through a modified series of microsurgical counter-autism prosthesis. Client's code is stored in a special chip. Barring squids, which we in the trade don't like to talk about. There's no way to recover your phrase. Can't drug it out, cut it out, torture it out. I don't know it, because I never did. Squids. Crawly things with arms. Superconducting quantum interfaces, detectors. Use them in the war to find submarines, suss out enemy cyber systems. Yeah, Navy stuff from the war. Even the primitive models could measure a magnetic field a billionth the strength of a geomagnetic force. It's like pulling a whisper out of a cheering stadium. Yeah, cops can do that already with parabolic microphones and lasers. But your data's still secure. No government let their cops have squids. Not even security heavies. Too much chance of interdepartmental funnies. They're too likely to Watergate you. Navy stuff. I got a friend down here who was in the Navy. Name's Jones. I think you better meet him. He's a junkie, though. We'll have to take him something. A junkie? A dolphin. He was more than a dolphin. But from another dolphin's point of view, he might have seemed like something less. I watched him swirling sluggishly in his galvanized tank, water stopped over the sides, wetting my shoes. He was surplus from the last war, a cyborg. He rose out of the water, showing us the crusted plates along his sides, a kind of visual pun. His grace nearly lost under articulated armor, clumsy, prehistoric. Twin deformities on either side of his skull had been engineered to a house sensor unit. Silver lesions gleamed on exposing sections of gray-white hide. And Molly, she just whistled. What is this place? I want you to talk with that war whale over there. Oh, that. Some whale Jones is. Jones reared again, fixed me with a sad and ancient eye. Well, how do we talk? That's the catch. Say, "Hi, Jones." And all the bulbs lit simultaneously. They were flashing red and white and blue. Good with the symbols, see? But the code. In the Navy, they had him wired into an audiovisual display. I've got the pure, Jones. You want it? And he froze in the water. I felt a strange panic remembering that he wasn't a fish, that he could drown. We want the key to Johnny's bank, Jones, and we want it fast. The lights flickered, died. Go for it, Jones. White sodium glare washed her features, stark monochrome, shadows cleaving from her cheekbones. The arms, I saw a red swastika that twisted in her silver glasses. Give it to him, I said. Hey, I think we've got it. Ralphie face, no imagination. Jones heaved half his armored bulk over the edge of his tank, and I thought the metal would give way. Molly stabbed at him overhand with the surette, driving the needle between the two plates. The propellant hissed, and patterns of light exploded, sparming across the frame and then fading to black. We just left him drifting, rolling in the dark water. Maybe he was dreaming of his war in the Pacific, or the cyber mines he swept nosing gently into the circuitry with the squid he'd used to pick Ralphie's pathetic password from the chip buried in my head. I can see them slipping up when he was demobbed, letting him out of the Navy with the gear intact. But how does a cybernetic dolphin get wired to smack? It's just the war. They all were. Navy did it. How else do you get him working for you? You know, I'm not sure this profile's a good business, the pirate said, angling for better money. Yeah, your target specs on ComSat. That isn't in the book. Waste my time, and you won't profile at all, said Molly, leaning across his scarred plastic desk to prod him with her forefinger. Oh, maybe you want to buy You microwave somewhere else? He was a tough kid, behind his mouth job. A night towner by birth, probably. Her hand blurred down the front of his jacket, completely severing a lapel without even rumpling the fabric. So we got a deal or not? Deal, he said, starting at his ruined lapel, with what he must have hoped was polite interest. Deal. While I checked the 2 records we'd bought, she extracted a slip of paper I'd given her from the zippered wrist pocket of her jacket. She unfolded it and read silently, moving her lips, and she shrugged. That's it? Shoot, I said, punching the record studs of the 2 desks simultaneously. It's just Christian White and his Aryan reggae band. Ralphie, a fan to his dying day. Transition to an idiot savant mode is always less abrupt than I expect it to be. The pirate broadcasters front with a familiar travel agency and a pastel cube that's boasted on a desk, 3 chairs, and a faded poster of a Swiss orbital spa. A pair of toy birds with blown glass bodies and tin legs were sipping monotonously from a styrofoam cup on the ledge beside Molly's shoulder. As I phased into mode, they accelerated gradually until their day-glow feathered crowns became solid arcs of color, and the LEDs that told seconds on the plastic wall clock had become meaninglessly pulsing grids, and Molly and the mal-faced boy grew hazy, their arms blurring occasionally in insect-quick ghosts of gestures, and then it all faded. Cool static and an endless tone poem in the artificial language, and I sat and sang Dead Ralphie's stolen program from what must have been 3 hours. The mall runs 40 kilometers from Ind, a ragged overlap of fuller domes, roofing what was once a subterranean. If they turn off the arcs on a clean day, a gray approximation of sunlight filters through the layers of acrylic, a view like the prison sketches of a Giovanni Piranesi. The 3 southernmost kilometers roof Night Town. Night Town pays no taxes, no utilities. The neon arcs are dead, and the geodesics have been smoked black by decades of cooking fires. In the nearly total darkness of Night Town noon, who notices a few dozen mad children lost in the rafters? We've been climbing for about 2 hours, up concrete stairs and steel ladders with perforated rungs past abandoned gantries and dust-covered tools. We started in what looked like a disused maintenance yard, stacked with a triangular roofing segment. Everything there had been covered with that same uniform layer of spray bomb graffiti. Gang names. Dates back to the turn of the century. The graffiti follows us up, gradually thinning until a single name was repeated at intervals. Low Tech. In dripping black capital letters. Who's Low Tech? Well, it's not us, is it, boss? She climbed a shivering aluminum ladder and vanished through a hole in the sheet of corrugated plastic. Stands for low technology. Low technology? The plastic ruffled her voice, and I followed her up, nursing an aching wrist. Low-techs. They'd think that shotgun trick of yours was magic. An hour later, I dragged myself up through another hole. This one sawed crookedly in a sagging sheet of plywood, and I met my first low-tech. It's okay, Molly said, her hand brushing my shoulder. It's just Dog. Hey, Dog. And a narrow beam of her taped flash. She regaled us with one eye and slowly extruded a thick length of grayish tongue, licking huge canines. I wondered how they wrote off tooth bud transplants from their Dobermans as low technology. Immunosuppressives don't exactly grow on trees. Dental augmentation impeded the low-tech speech. A string of saliva dangled from his lower lip.
Heard you coming. Long time.
He might have been 15, but the fangs and the bright mosaic of scars combined with gaping sockets to present a mask of total bestiality. It had taken time and a certain kind of creativity to assemble that face, and his posture told me he enjoyed living behind it. He wore a pair of decaying jeans, black with grime and shiny about the creases. His chest and feet were bare. He did something with his mouth that approximated a grin.
They've been following you.
And far off in Nighttown, a water vendor cried his trade. Strings jumping, dog? She swung her flash to the side, and I thought thin cords tied to eye bolts, cords that ran to the edge and vanished. She snapped off the light.
How come he followed you? Got no light.
Oh, he doesn't need it. That one's bad news, dog. Your sentries give him a tumble. They'll come home in an easy-to-carry section.
The friend.
He sounded uneasy. I heard his feet shift on the worn plywood. No, but he's mine. And this one, slapping my shoulder, he's a friend. Got that? He said sure without much enthusiasm, padding to the platform edge where the eye bolts were. He began to pluck out some kind of message on the taut cords. Nighttown spread beneath us like a toy village of rats. Tiny windows showed candlelight with only a few harsh, bright squares lit by battery lanterns and carbide lamps. I imagined the old men at their endless games of dominoes under warm, fat drops of water that fell from wet wash, hung out on poles between the plywood shanties. And then I tried to imagine climbing, patiently, up through the darkness into Azores, and unlead tourist shirts and bland and unhurried movements. How was he tracking us? Good, said Molly. He smells up.
Smoke.
Dog dragged a crumpled pack from his pocket and pried out a flattened cigarette. I squinted and trademark while he lit it for me with a kitchen match. Yuyan filters. Beijing cigarettes. I decided that the low-techs were black marketeers. Dog and Molly went back to their argument, which seemed to resolve around Molly's desire to use some particular piece of low-tech real estate. I've done you a lot of favors, and I want that floor, and I want the music.
You're not low-tech.
This must have been going on for the better part of a twisted kilometer, Dog leading us along swaying catwalks and up rope ladders. The low-techs leached their webs, huddling places to the city's fabric with thick gobs of epoxy, and sleep above the abyss in mesh hammocks. Their country is so attenuated that in places it consists of little more than holes and feet, sawed and geodesic struts. What she wanted was something called the killing floor. And scrambling after her, my new Eddie back shoes, slipping on worm, metal, and damp plywood, I wondered how it would be any more lethal than the rest of the territory. At the same time, I sensed that Dog's protests were a ritual, and that she'd already expected to get whatever it was she wanted. Somewhere beneath us, Jones would be circling his Taken, feeling his twinges of junk sickness. The police would be boring the drome regulars with questions about Ralphie. What did he do? Who was he before he stepped outside? And the Yakuza would be settling its ghostly bulk over the city databanks, probing for faint images of me, reflected in numbered accounts, security transactions, bills for utilities. We're an information economy. They teach you that in school. What they don't tell you is that it's impossible to move, to live, to operate on any level without leaving traces, bits, seemingly meaningless fragments of personal information. Fragments that can be retrieved and then amplified. But by now, the pirate would have shuttled our message into line for the black box transmissions to the Yakuza ComSat. A simple message. Call off the dogs, or we wideband your program. The program. I still have no idea what it contained. I only sing the song with zero comprehension. It was probably research data. The Yakuza being given to advanced forms of industrial espionage. Genteel business. Stealing from the Ono Sendai as a matter of course, and politely holding their data for ransom. Threatening to blunt the conglomerate's research edge to make the product public. But why couldn't any number play? Why wouldn't they be happier with something to sell back to Ono Sendai? Happier than they'd be with one dead Johnny from Memory Lane. Their program was on its way to an address in Sydney, to a place that had letters for clients and didn't ask questions once you paid a small retainer. 4th class surface mail. I'd erased most of the other copies and recorded our message in the resulting gap, leaving just enough of the program to identify it as the real thing. My wrist hurt. I wanted to stop, lie down, sleep. I knew that I'd lose my grip, fall soon. Knew that the sharp black shoes I'd bought for my evening as Eddie Banks would lose their purchase and carry me down to Night Town. But he rose in my mind like a cheap religious hologram, glowing, the enlarged chip in his Hawaiian shirt, looming like a reconnaissance shot of some doomed urban nucleus. And so, I followed Dog and Molly through low-tech heaven, jury-rigged and jury-built from scraps that even Nighttown didn't want. The killing floor, as it turned out, was 8 meters on a side. A giant had threaded steel cables back and forth to a junkyard and drawn it all taut. It creaked when it moved, and it moved constantly, swaying and bucking. The gathering low-techs arranged themselves on the shelf of plywood surrounding it. The wood was silver with age, polished with long use and deeply etched with initials, threats, declarations of passion. This was suspended from a separate set of cables, which lashed themselves in darkness beyond the raw white glare of the 2 ancient floods suspended above the floor. A girl with teeth, like dogs, hit the floor on all fours. Then, she was across the floor, laughing, grappling with a boy who was drinking dark liquid from a liter flask. Low-tech fashion ran to scars and tattoos and teeth. The electricity they were tapping to light the killing floor seemed to be an exception to their overall aesthetic. Made in the name of what? Ritual? Sport? Maybe even art. I didn't know. But I could see the floor was something special. I had to look at something being assembled over generations. I held the useless shotgun under my jacket. Its hardness and left were comforting, even though I had no more shells. And it came to me that I had no idea at all what was happening, or what was supposed to happen. And that was the nature of the game, because I spent most of my life as a blind receptacle to be filled with other people's knowledge and then drained, spouting synthetic languages I'd never understood. Like I said, I'm a very technical boy. And then I noticed just how quiet the low-techs had become. He was there, at the edge of the light, taking in the killing floor and the gallery of silent low-techs with a tourist's calm. And as our eyes met for the first time with mutual recognition, a memory clicked into place for me. A memory of Paris, and the long Mercedes electrics gliding through the rain to Notre Dame. Mobile greenhouses, Japanese faces behind the glass, and 100 Nikons rising in blind phototropism. Flowers of steel and crystal behind his eyes as they found me. Those same shutters wiring. I looked for Molly Millions. She was gone. The low-techs parted to let him step up onto the bench. He bowed, smiling, stepped smoothly out of his sandals, leaving them side by side, perfectly aligned, and then he stepped down onto the killing floor. And he came for me, across that shifting trampoline of scrap, as easily as any tourist padding across synthetic pile in any featureless hotel. Then, Molly hit the floor, and she was moving, and the floor, it screamed. It was mic'd and it amplified with pickups riding the 4 fat coil springs at the corners, and contact mics taped at random to rustling machine fragments. And somewhere, somehow, the low-techs had an amp. And now I made out of shapes of speakers overhead above the cruel white floods. A drumbeat began. Electronic, like an amplified heart. Steady as a metronome, and she moved her leather jacket and boots, her t-shirt, sleeveless, faint T-tails at Chiba City, circuitry chased along her arms, her leather jacket gleamed under the floods, and she began to dance. She flexed her knees, white feet tensed on a flattened gas tank, and the killing floor began to heave in response. And the sound it made was like a world is ending right there, like the wires that hold heaven snapped and coiled across the sky. And he rode with it, and for a few heartbeats, and then he moved, judging the movement of the floor perfectly, like a man stepping from one flat stone to another in an ornamental garden. And he pulled the tip from his thumb with the grace of a man at ease with social gesture, and he flung it at her. And under the floods, the filament refracted threads of rainbow, and she threw herself flat and rolled, jackknifing up as the molecules whipped past, steel claws snapping the light in what must have been an automatic rictus of defense. The drum pulse quickened, and she bounced with it, her dark hair wild around the blank silver lenses, her mouth thin, lips taut with concentration, and the killing floor, it boomed, and it roared. And the low-techs, they were screaming with excitement. And he retracted the filament to a whirling meter-wide circle of ghostly polychrome and spun it in front of him, Tumble's hand-held levers with his sternum a shield. Molly seemed to let something go, something inside, and that was the real start of her mad dog dance. She jumped, twisting, lunging, sideways, landing with both feet on an alloy engine block wired directly to one of the coil springs. I cupped my hand over my ears and knelt in a vertigo of sound, thinking floor and benches were on their way down to Nighttown. And I saw us tearing through the shanties, the wet wash, exploding in the tiles like frozen rotten fruit. But the cables, they held, and the killing floor rose. It felt like a crazy metal sea, and Molly, she just danced on. And at the end, just before we made his final cast with the filament, I saw his face. An expression that didn't seem to belong there. It wasn't fear and it wasn't anger, it was disbelief. Stunned incomprehension mingled with pure aesthetic revulsion at what he was seeing and hearing. The floor carried her down, the molecule passing just above her head. The floor whiplashed, lifting him into the path of the taut molecule. Partly, I think, he took that dive to buy himself a few seconds of dignity, silence. But honestly, I think she killed him with culture shock. And since then, I decided to stay up here. And when I look out across the killing floor before he came, I saw how hollow I was, and I knew I was sick of being a bucket for other people. So now I climb down, and I visit Jones almost every night. We're partners now. Jones, that dolphin, and I, and Molly Millions. Yeah, she's part of the group too. Molly handles our business in the drome. Jones is still in Funland, but he has a bigger tank with fresh seawater tucked in once a week. And he has his junk when he needs it. We're all making good money. Better money than I made before. Because Jones's squid can read the traces of anything. In the meantime, it's really okay up here, way up in the dark. Smoking Chinese filter tip and listening to the condensation that drips from the geodesics. It's real quiet up here, unless a pair of low-techs decide to dance on the killing floor. It's educational too. With Jones's help, I'll figure this out. Hey, I'm getting to be the most technical boy in town.